Tinian Island, the Mariana Islands, August 6, 1945. It is just past midnight and the air is thick with the smell of aviation fuel. On a runway carved from coral by American engineers, a modified B-29 Superfortress sits under floodlights, her polished aluminium skin gleaming like something from another world. Ground crews move around her with a strange, deliberate quietness, the kind of hush that settles over men who know they are about to do something that cannot be undone. Painted beneath the cockpit, in small stencilled letters, is a name borrowed from a pilot's mother, Enola Gay. Inside her bomb bay hangs a single weapon, 5 tons of steel and machined uranium, nicknamed with the flat, almost domestic humor that men use to make the unbearable bearable. They call it Little Boy. Colonel Paul Tibbets checks his instruments one final time. Somewhere in the darkness, a chaplain has already said a prayer for the crew, though not, notably, for what lies beneath them. At 2:45 in the morning, the great engines roar to life and the aircraft lumbers down the runway, so heavy with its cargo that observers watching from the ground genuinely wonder whether she will lift off at all. She does, barely, the wheels leaving the coral with meters to spare. 6.5 hours later, over a city of some 350,000 people going about an ordinary Monday morning, a bombardier named Thomas Ferebee peers through a Norden bombsight at a distinctive T-shaped bridge and lets go. 43 seconds later, at a height chosen with mathematical precision to maximize destruction, the weapon detonates. In that instant, a temperature exceeding that of the sun's surface blooms over Hiroshima. A city vanishes, and the world, whether it fully understood this yet or not, steps across a threshold from which there is no return. This is the story of how that weapon came to exist, the decision that sent it on its way, and the argument over that decision which has never, in 8 decades, gone quiet. To understand why such a weapon was ever built, you have to understand the war that made it seem necessary. By the summer of 1945, the conflict in the Pacific had already ground on for nearly 4 years, and it was, by any measure, one of the most brutal campaigns in human history. American planners looking toward an invasion of the Japanese home islands, an operation given the code name Downfall, were working from grim precedent. On Iwo Jima, a volcanic rock barely 20 square kilometers in size, American forces had suffered close to 26,000 casualties in 5 weeks of fighting. On Okinawa, the last major battle before the mainland itself, the toll was staggering. Roughly 50,000 American casualties, well over 100,000 Japanese military dead, and a civilian death toll, many by mass suicide encouraged through propaganda, that may have reached 150,000. If resistance on the home islands followed this pattern, and Japanese doctrine and rhetoric gave every indication it would, the projected cost of invasion was almost too large to comprehend. Estimates prepared for American planners varied wildly, from several 100,000 to well over 1 million Allied casualties, with Japanese losses, military and civilian combined, potentially running into the millions. Conventional bombing had already demonstrated its own terrible arithmetic without forcing surrender. The firebombing of Tokyo on the night of 9th to 10th March 1945 killed an estimated 100,000 people in a single evening, more than either atomic bombing would kill outright, and Japan's leadership had not sued for peace. 67 Japanese cities had by this point been substantially destroyed by incendiary raids. And still the Japanese Supreme Council for the direction of the war remained divided, with a powerful faction insisting on a fight to the finish, a doctrine summarized in the chilling phrase Ketsu Go, or Operation Decisive. It was against this backdrop of a war that conventional means seemed unable to end and an invasion that promised casualties on an almost unimaginable scale, that American, British, and exiled European scientists had for several years been pursuing something that, at the outset, sounded like science fiction, a weapon that could unleash the energy locked within the atomic nucleus itself. The theoretical foundation had been laid not in a military laboratory but in physics departments and letters. In 1939, Albert Einstein, prompted by the physicist Leo Szilard, wrote to President Roosevelt warning that Nazi Germany might be pursuing exactly this kind of weapon, built upon discoveries in nuclear fission made by German scientists Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann only months earlier. The fear that Hitler's Germany might get there first was, for many of the scientists involved, the moral engine that justified the entire enterprise. Several of the physicists working on the project, Szilard prominent among them, were Jewish refugees who understood with terrible clarity what a fascist regime armed with such a weapon would mean. What followed was the largest, most secretive, and most expensive scientific and industrial undertaking the world had ever seen. Known as the Manhattan Project, it drew together an extraordinary concentration of scientific talent under the military direction of General Leslie Groves and the scientific leadership of physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, based at a purpose-built laboratory at Los Alamos, New Mexico, a mesa-top site so secret that its very existence was denied. Around it grew an industrial network spread across the United States, vast enrichment facilities at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, working to separate the rare, fissile isotope of uranium from its far more common cousin, and enormous production reactors at Hanford, Washington, generating a different fissile material entirely, plutonium, as a byproduct of reactor operation. By 1945, the project employed roughly 130,000 people and had consumed close to $2 billion, an almost inconceivable sum for the time, and one kept hidden even from most members of Congress. Two distinct weapon designs emerged from this effort, reflecting the two different fissile materials being produced. The uranium weapon, Little Boy, used what is known as a gun-type design, in which one mass of uranium is fired down a barrel into a second mass, the two combining to exceed what physicists call critical mass, the threshold at which a self-sustaining chain reaction becomes possible. It was considered reliable enough that it was never even tested before its combat use over Hiroshima, the only time in history a weapon of this kind has been deployed without a prior trial. The plutonium weapon, more temperamental in its physics, required a far more sophisticated approach, an implosion design in which conventional high explosives, arranged with extraordinary precision around a plutonium core, compress the material inward simultaneously from all sides. This design demanded proof, and so it was tested first in the New Mexico desert on July 16, 1945, in an operation Oppenheimer named Trinity, after a line of poetry by John Donne. Witnesses miles away described a light brighter than several suns, and Oppenheimer himself later recalled a line from the Bhagavad Gita drifting through his mind. "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." News of Trinity's success reached President Harry Truman, who had only become president upon Roosevelt's death in April and had not even known of the weapon's existence until then, while he was at the Potsdam Conference negotiating the post-war order with Stalin and Churchill. Truman now held a decision of almost unbearable weight. On July 26th, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding Japan's unconditional surrender and warning of prompt and utter destruction should it refuse. Japan's government, still hoping for Soviet mediation and internally divided, gave a response that was interpreted, rightly or wrongly, as rejection. If you are finding the history behind this story interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know, and there's a great deal more of this story still to come. The order authorizing use of the weapon had, in effect, already been drafted before Trinity even succeeded, on the assumption of success. Following Hiroshima and Japan's continued failure to surrender within the following days, a second weapon, the plutonium implosion device nicknamed Fat Man, was dropped on the city of Nagasaki on August 9th by a B-29 named Boxcar, commanded by Major Charles Sweeney. Nagasaki had not even been the primary target that day. Cloud cover over the intended city of Kokura diverted the mission at the last moment. a twist of weather that historians still note with a kind of grim disbelief. Estimates of the dead at Hiroshima, factoring deaths in the following months from burns, radiation sickness, and injury, range from around 135,000 to as high as 146,000. At Nagasaki, estimates run to roughly 74,000. These figures remain contested and imprecise, in part because so many records and so many record keepers were destroyed in the same instant. It is worth pausing here on what is documented and what is still argued over, because this is one of the most fiercely debated decisions in modern history. Some historians and several senior American military figures of the time, including Fleet Admiral William Leahy and General Dwight Eisenhower, later expressed the view that Japan was already close to surrender and that the bombings were militarily unnecessary. Others point to the fanatical resistance still being organized, the attempted military coup against Emperor Hirohito's own decision to surrender that took place on the very night he recorded his surrender broadcast, and argue that only the shock of the atomic bombs, combined with the Soviet Union's declaration of war against Japan on August 8th, broke the deadlock within Japan's government. What can be said with confidence is that on August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito addressed his nation by radio for the first time in history, announcing Japan's surrender in famously indirect language, stating that the war situation had developed, in his words, not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Germany, it later emerged, had never come remotely close to a working weapon. Its own nuclear program, hampered by the emigration of Jewish scientists under Nazi racial policy, by resource shortages, and by a research approach that pursued a heavy-water reactor rather than a bomb with any real urgency, never progressed beyond early experimental stages. The Soviet Union, by stark contrast, had been running an aggressive espionage operation against the Manhattan Project itself, and detonated its own first atomic device within 4 years of Hiroshima, in August 1949, a timeline that stunned American intelligence and opened the era that would come to define the following half-century. The Cold War and the doctrine of mutually assured destruction. The legacy of those 2 mornings in August 1945 is almost impossible to overstate, and almost impossible to summarize neatly. In the most immediate sense, the bombings, alongside the Soviet invasion of Manchuria, brought the Second World War to its end without the invasion that had been feared, sparing, by the reckoning of those who authorized the weapon's use, a far greater number of lives than were lost in the bombings themselves, a calculation that survivors and critics alike have questioned ever since. In the longer sense, the weapon reshaped the architecture of global power entirely. Nuclear arsenals grew through the following decades to include the Soviet Union, Britain, France, China, and eventually others, creating a strategic balance defined by terror rather than trust. Survivors of the bombings, known in Japan as hibakusha, endured decades of radiation-related illness, social stigma, and a determination, many of them, to speak out globally against nuclear weapons, work that would eventually contribute to a Nobel Peace Prize awarded to the Japanese survivor organization Nihon Hidankyo in 2024. Today, visitors to Hiroshima can walk through the Peace Memorial Park, where the skeletal dome of a former exhibition hall, left standing almost exactly as the blast left it, remains one of the most quietly devastating structures on Earth. At Los Alamos and at the National Museum of Nuclear Science and History in Albuquerque, the scientific side of the story is preserved in exhibits that still draw enormous crowds. Oppenheimer himself, who would go on to oppose the development of the far more powerful hydrogen bomb, had his security clearance stripped in 1954 amid Cold War paranoia, a decision the United States government would not formally repudiate for nearly 7 decades until 2022. Return for a moment to that runway on Tinian, to the hush before the engines started. In that hush was contained an entire argument that the world has still not finished having, about necessity and horror, about the ending of one kind of war and the beginning of a new and more frightening kind of peace, about what scientists owe to the world for what they discover and what governments owe to their citizens for how they use it. The atomic bomb did not simply end the Second World War. It rewrote the terms on which every subsequent conflict would have to be considered, because for the first time in human history, a small number of people in a single decision could end not just a battle or a city, but potentially a civilization. Truman would later write that he never lost a night's sleep over his decision, a claim biographers still debate. Oppenheimer, by contrast, spent the rest of his life visibly haunted by what he had helped build, telling Truman in a White House meeting that he felt he had blood on his hands, a remark that reportedly left the president furious and unmoved. Between those two reactions lies most of what still needs to be understood about August 6, 1945. A weapon built by brilliant, frightened people racing a war they were terrified of losing, unleashed by a decision made in weeks rather than years, whose consequences are still, 80 years later, being weighed. The bomb ended a war. It did not end the argument. And perhaps that argument, kept alive by historians, survivors, and every person who has ever stood beneath that skeletal dome in Hiroshima, is exactly as it should be: unfinished, uncomfortable, and impossible to look away from.